Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's discussion of the impacts of forest structure on water quality and native fish, brought to you by the Lower Nehalem Community Trust. My name is Ben Pittenger, and I am the Executive Director of the Lower Nehalem Community Trust. Our service area is the Lower Nehalem River watershed on the north coast of Oregon. To begin the evening, I want to acknowledge that our service area has been, for thousands of years, the traditional home of the Nehalem tribe of Native peoples. Sadly, my knowledge of their history is not strong, but I understand that here in Western Oregon, many of the tribes are interrelated and share descendancy. Some of the Nehalem peoples are now affiliated with the Clatsop-Nehalem Confederated Tribes, and I also understand that some of the descendants of the Nehalem people are enrolled in the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. Next, I'd like to take a few moments to orient you to the Zoom platform we're using this evening and welcome our attendees and panelists. If you're familiar with Zoom meetings, you may have already noticed some differences. For instance, you do not have a camera or microphone to worry about, but we want you to be involved and we invite you to ask questions of our panelists. We will be using the Q&A function exclusively to do this tonight. You can find this on computers by hovering over the bottom of the screen or on handheld devices by pulling down from the top. Please submit your questions as soon as you think of them. There's no need to wait until the Q&A segment of the presentation. Our moderator is standing by to review all the questions as they come in. She will consolidate them if necessary and address them to our panel. We'll acknowledge your question and try to answer as many as possible in the time allotted. The Lower Nehalem Community Trust is a nonprofit land trust. Our mission is to preserve land and nurture conservation values in the Nehalem region of the Oregon coast through education and involvement of our community. Next, I want you to please welcome our panelists. Gabe Shuships grew up in Oregon and brings a Native American perspective with training and experience in environmental restoration and enhancement of Indigenous first foods, focusing on native fish of the Pacific Northwest. He is an enrolled citizen of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation and leads the nonprofit Tributaries Network. I invite you to visit their website and see what they do. Josh Seeds brings perspectives that have evolved over his years of hiking the forests of the Pacific Northwest and working with Oregon communities on forest and water quality issues for the state of Oregon. Welcome, Josh and Gabe.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Ben.
All right. Well, thank you, Ben. I think with that, I will get started and I'll share a few of my slides. Well, thank you again, Ben, Josh, and everybody from Lower Nehalem for welcoming me tonight. I'm excited to talk about forest structure and its impact on water quality and the native fish community of the Nehalem River system. So where I'm coming from tonight is a group known as the Tributaries Network. It's a 501c3 nonprofit that's entirely volunteer driven and is dedicated to cultural and environmental education and ecological restoration through an Indigenous worldview. And is based here in the Pacific Northwest and is made up of tribes and tribal members from Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. But through my work and in my day job, I wear, kind of as Ben referenced, I wear a lot of different hats. I work with a friends group as the executive director based here in Portland, Oregon. I'm originally from Northeast Oregon, from just outside of Pendleton. And in my work with Oregon State Parks, who many of you know steward about 250 of our natural areas and state parks and some of our key public lands. I work to remind them and work alongside them that each state park is built atop Indigenous lands, and each state park can kind of honor that through education and outreach and connection with the local tribes. And just to kind of ground the presentation, my work is really kind of grounded in values that were continued through Indigenous worldview and time immemorial, as we say, but really looking at time and history as the landscape has changed. And so I'm calling in from Portland, Oregon right now, which is my home base. And kind of looking at the landscape here, I put together this simple linear metric to just show and kind of recognize just how long Indigenous people have been on these lands, have occupied and utilized this landscape in comparison with European presence, which is in the orange there. Here in Portland, about the early 1800s or so. And this is very much based on a Western calendar. But if this was built off more of a kind of more of the Indigenous perspective or traditional ecological knowledge as we reference it, Indigenous people here in Oregon go back over 40,000 years. In California recently, human remains have been dated back about 110,000 years. And that's what this circular graph references. But some of our traditional stories and our traditional knowledge dates back before the Missoula floods on the coast. A lot of stories reference, tsunamis and other events that happened 300 plus years ago. But really just kind of referencing the time, the kind of reference to time. I think many of us probably grew up learning or, hearing about the Bering Strait theory. And I remember learning about that in high school. And since then, that theory has been debunked, or it's been proven that people occupied North America far before the Bering Strait, the ice bridge from Siberia to Alaska was navigable or passable. So these graphs are just in reference to that, and recognition that tribal people have been using this landscape, working with its local ecology for a long time. My work is based in what I reference to as time immemorial, but values and a worldview that predates colonization here in North America, and that is really central and celebrated around first foods. And for reference, first foods are native fish, native game, native roots, and native berries. This is an example of traditional ecological knowledge right here. This is what's known as a seasonal round. This is a place-based phenological calendar that really was inherent knowledge that was passed along familiarly and based on your tribe and your tribal region. This is knowledge that was central to survival, but also really central to the kind of key balances in life. And this is knowledge that steered my career as a fish biologist, educator, and now the leader of a nonprofit. And you'll see recognized here. This is more from my area of Eastern Oregon, but you'll see kind of central in this circular object is our tools of how we acquired our first foods, our dip nets, our digging sticks, our baskets, our hunting materials. On that kind of middle circular object there, you'll see our native fish, our native game, mule deer, elk, avian species, of course, Pacific lamprey, salmon, salmon and steelhead were and are important staples to the indigenous diet. And then in the outer ring there, we have our native plants. So things like huckleberries, different root species, things that are prominent typically in the spring and the summer. And so this is really connected to our practices of ceremony, and our what we call our first foods are celebrated each spring through the summer for every year that they return, and they're really what complements our life and what is really is really what our ceremonies and our cultural practices are dedicated to. And we have a serving order that we follow and that we respect. And really at the first place in our serving order is water. Of course, water is life. We call water kush, and it is central to all of our being, to our fish, to our sustenance. And then followed by our native fish species, our native game. So some, familiar to us in our coastal region, and then followed by our plants, our roots. So in Eastern Oregon, most of our plants grow underground. You can imagine they've been abrupted by current land practices, cattle grazing, etc. And also finally our berries. So both chokecherry and huckleberry of the mountain species, which are typically found at a certain elevation in Oregon, Washington, Montana, and Idaho. But this relationship to our first foods in this serving order is really central to our land management practices and also I guess, what you would call our conservation beliefs. So this has really guided me in my, I guess, livelihood or work. For most of my career, I've worked as a fish biologist, focusing on native fish of the Pacific Northwest. I spent a long time focused on Pacific lamprey, looking at their local ecology and habitats, and really trying to figure out more about this kind of what's often thought as a cryptic species. I mean, as a non-game fish, there's less known about lamprey. Many of us know they're the oldest living fish species. They were once abundant in our coastal and streams beyond. Um, and as we say, what's good for lamprey is good for salmon. So I have a kind of a traditional or maybe a Western background in fisheries biology or fish science, and have spent a lot of time traversing Oregon and Washington's river systems. But really what drives me to this work is that I'm also a practitioner of being a fisherman, a hunter, and someone who picks berries or collects roots. And this is earlier this year, fishing for smelt up on the Cowlitz River in Southwest Washington. This picture in the lower left is gathering huckleberries up near Mount Adams in central Washington. And through all of these practices, which if you remember really tie back to our seasonal round, a lot of my work now is shifted into the education or into sharing this knowledge with our future generations, which is what I do in my role as the executive director for the Friends of Tryon Creek. We are a 51-year-old organization that is dedicated to nurturing and inspiring relationships with the natural world in our urban forest. And that's the picture on the right there. So what brought me here tonight, aside from what I've shared, is really my connection to promoting what's most important is drinking water and access to it, and sustainability of drinking water for future generations. I was called to this work back in 2016 in Standing Rock, North Dakota, where this photo is from, Cannonball, North Dakota, the Standing Rock Indian Reservation, with the protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline. Many of you are probably familiar from the media, but this pipeline was eventually enacted despite the months-long protests, and it has recently been challenged through the Biden administration. But this was an effort that called on all people, Indigenous and other, to really stand up for a community that didn't have much of a voice in a very divided state that North Dakota is. Secondly, through my work in the Tributaries Network, I facilitate education around accessing safe drinking water in the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation, many of us know, is located in southwestern United States. It encompasses Arizona, New Mexico, a small part of Colorado, and Utah. This is the largest Native American reservation in the U.S., and about 70% of the population lives without proper drinking water infrastructure. So in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic devastated the reservation, and which accounted for many fatalities, and throughout most of the year had the highest percentage of positive COVID cases per capita. Um, Many of this was thought to be spread um, by the conditions of the access to drinking water, which for about 70% of the residents is pumped. Um, and Also in relation prior to COVID, um, the, the, the emergency rooms epidemic of gastrointestinal disease is about 40%. So the water that is accessible is often contaminated. It's contaminated by groundwater, local land use, um, other things that are at bay. So kind of this combination of COVID and unsafe water infrastructure really contributed to this problem. And in my work, I help to facilitate education around how to access clean drinking water, how to properly chlorinate, how and when to access this water for the large population of folks down there who don't have um, proper water infrastructure, and who have been hauling their water since time immemorial. Closer to home, in central Washington, there is a similar concern for the Warren Springs people, for the Confederate Tribes of Warren Springs in Central Oregon, whose water infrastructure within the last few years has failed. And several times over the last few years, the population has been without adequate drinking water. So similarly, they are in dire need, and through the COVID-19 pandemic, that added an extra layer um, of impact. And similarly, tribal populations throughout the U.S. Were greatly decimated and impacted by COVID-19. It was truly an environmental justice issue, and still is. Um, so my approach to this is really, you know, our solutions to many of these problems can't be solved by the same system that created them. This is my argument for Indigenous knowledge. Um, and in Oregon and Washington, uh, Indigenous knowledge is really grounded by a belief system. In short, and this is what we call Tamanwit, which is considered a natural law, really something that guides tribal people through reciprocity and balance. Tamanwit is seen in everything that we do. Some might consider it similar to the idea of the Buddhist idea of karma, but this isn't a criminal, civil, business, or international law. But this is really the idea of living within balance, living in your social group within balance, in your family, living in your relationship with the natural world or the environment also in balance. You know, harvesting or gathering what you need, and allowing things to spawn or to live another year to sustain their own populations. So this is in short and the very abbreviated definition. But a contemporary manifestation of Tamanwit, or the natural law. Here in the U.S., there's 562 different tribes who are often the descendant of more tribes. So there's a lot of tribal diversity here in the U.S. Through language and connection. But a colleague of mine here in Portland, Dr. Terry Cross, developed what is known as the Relational Worldview. And so this is a tenet that is practiced in child welfare and social services, but this is really a manifestation of the natural law, and it's represented through this quadrant. And really, it's finding that balance between your physical being, your mind, your mental acuity, the context, meaning your situation, your house, your school, your workplace, and then your spirit, or your innate connection to things that are larger, or lesser seen, or lesser understood, or kind of what grounds you, um, while not necessarily being a connection with Western religion. It can be for some, but really just finding that daily balance and recognizing it, and working to strive towards that. um, so kind of walking through how we got here um, in our landscape. And this is another very abbreviated version, as we're a little short on time. But really, colonization of the Americas um, goes back to about 1455. The Pope of the time, um, sent forth people to enslave, spoliate, and subjugate all folks who were deemed non-Christians. And a lot of my research looking at this time and this era, it really spoke of this place that we now know as North America being this place of vast resource, but with few people here. And so this is what led to Manifest Destiny, westward expansion, ultimately to lands being used in much different ways, lands taken, lands developed, moving forward, things like the Dust Bowl, for example, or different farming practices. The mass killing of the American bison or the buffalo. All of these different actions are really what brought us here today. So similarly, here in Oregon, um, we had a lot more people that came in with different understandings of how to utilize the landscape. Um, as we know, the biggest historic economy and one of the largest changes to the landscape is logging. And logging practices have changed over the years. That photo up there goes back to the period of log jams or checkpoint dams that our coastal and many of our Willamette streams still show remnants of. The kind of low level dams that that were used to drive logs down into larger tributaries. And from a lot of my work and research, I know from some Siletz and Grand Ronde friends that in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, many of the loggers back then were Indigenous peoples who were working to make money to provide for their families, and they often worked the more dangerous jobs, as obviously the logging technology isn't what it is today. And then, of course, railroads. Railroads still today threaten our environment. The advent of coal trains and fracking waste that's brought into our state from elsewhere. And then for a fish person like myself, large-scale hydroelectric dams have changed our river systems, really created a reservoir system that's largely impassable for our native fish. So kind of alternating with the relational worldview is the kind of the linear worldview, or the Western worldview. And simply put, X on an XY axis, if we start with this point and then we add this treatment, we'll get these results. This is a very direct relationship. This is the this is the thought behind most of Western science, and really the thought that drives a lot of our technology today, which differs from the relational worldview that I shared earlier, where the ultimate goal is finding that balance. So I'm right up on time, but some in our recent history, a few examples of where a more relational worldview in regards to our environment would have been helpful is the idea of wooden streams. Tribes knew from utilizing rivers, fishing, observing beaver, that wooden streams was a good thing. Created habitat for salmon and steelhead and lamprey, and it was a natural part of our ecosystem. Also fire. So fire is an important part of our entire state, has an important relationship, and has largely been suppressed for the last 100 years or so. So one example of these management practices, really grounding in first foods, some of those slides, this slide that I shared earlier, is the Umatilla River Vision. This is a conservation plan built by the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla, my tribe, that really grounds restoration goals in first food values. And this is only about 13 years old, so the results are still coming in. But as far as I know, this is the only conservation plan grounded and guided in Indigenous values. So with that said, I usually like to end on this slide, which is a fisheries hero of mine, Billy Frank Jr., who worked and lived in the Puget Sound and was a civil rights era advocate for reclaiming tribal fishing rights. So thank you. I think with that said, I will stop sharing and turn it over to Joshua Seeds. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Gabe. That's going to be hard to follow, but I'll give it a go. All right. So my name is Joshua Seeds. I work for the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. I'm in the Water Quality Division. The programs I'm in are drinking water protection and non-point source pollution. So non-point source pollution is landscape pollution. It's not coming from a pipe. It's not coming from, a ditch or something like that. Non-point source pollution is coming from the landscape. So it can be from, natural erosion in a forested environment. It can be from logging. It can be from agriculture, grazing, and so on. So that's obviously going to be important for this. I'm going to put things more specifically into a drinking water context. And so to start with, forest lands are pretty crucially important, especially in Western Oregon, for drinking water sources. In Eastern Oregon, there's fewer public water systems that get their water off the land. Usually it's groundwater, but in Western Oregon, it's really important. Most of the Willamette Valley is a series of interconnected drinking water source areas. As far as the number of people, most Oregonians get their water from public water systems. Most of those are coming out of lands that are at least in part forested. And so, the issues of concern on forest lands, I think, are pretty well known. The extent of harvest activity, what kind of riparian protection is in place, failures of steep slopes, roads, wildfire. Obviously, that kicked into high gear in Western Oregon last year. And then applications of chemicals like pesticides or fire retardants. I'd call your attention to the upper left part of this map, and really all along the coastal portion of it, along the left side of the map. You'll see all those little dots. It's kind of hard to see. Those are all small watersheds where different communities or little rural water districts get their drinking water. Most of those are forested lands. So coming in closer to the lower Nehalem, and just to the north of it and just to the south of it, there's quite a few public water systems, again, that in this part of the landscape, they're getting their water from from forest land. And on the coast, that's the primary land use is forestry, whether it's public land or private land, whether it's managed passively or actively, it's mostly forest land. And so within the Nehalem, there's Wheeler and Rockaway Beach and City of Nehalem, going farther up, Burnt Creek and the Timber Water Association, and then just on the other side of the watershed boundary, we've got Warrenton and Jewel and Seaside. So like, how does it work? So Gabe really talked about the Indigenous perspective, and so I'm going to come more from my role working for a state agency. And so protecting drinking water in Oregon, the responsibility is kind of divided between Oregon Health Authority and the Department of Environmental Quality and some other agencies. Oregon Health Authority regulates finished drinking water. So after it comes out of the treatment plant and when it's going through the distribution system, that's where Oregon Health Authority is the regulator. Before it gets to the intake pipe, before it goes into the drinking water treatment plant, then DEQ is the primary regulator. And so we've got authorities from state law, Clean Water Act, and so on. That's supposed to allow us to protect source water so that it's clean when it gets to clean enough when it gets to the intake. There are other agencies involved. Under state law, Oregon Department of Forestry has exclusive regulatory authority for non-point source pollution control on any non-federal forest lands. So they're supposed to have practices in place to meet water quality standards and the targets set by total maximum daily loads, which are pollution control plans for water bodies that aren't meeting standards. Similar role is filled by Oregon Department of Agriculture for agricultural lands and rural residential, and then mining. And so DEQ kind of works with and through these agencies for forest lands, for agricultural lands, for mining operations, respectively. And that does have implications for what DEQ can and cannot do on the regulation side. So water treatment, I think there's a common conception that drinking water treatment is magic. Gabe gave an example I've been following closely, which is out of the state of Oregon's purview because it's happening in the Warm Springs Reservation. But systems can break down if they're not maintained, and any given drinking water treatment technology has limits on what kind of raw water quality it can remove. On one end of the scale, we've got the city of Wilsonville, which has a system that can remove almost anything, including contaminants like pesticides and fire retardants and so on. On the other end, we would have small coastal systems that are using slow sand filtration. And if the turbidity gets higher than 5 or 10 neplometric turbidity units, which is really hard to spot with the naked eye, that's too much floating fine sediment to treat, and they have to wait until water quality improves. So if source water is meeting the standards of the Clean Water Act, conventional treatment should be adequate. Shouldn't have to do a lot of special treatment to get things. So where we run into trouble is where turbidity has been elevated over the natural background in a long-term ongoing way, or where toxic chemicals have been added to water that a system wasn't designed to remove because they're not naturally occurring. And so when we start running into water quality problems in source water, there's just kind of a question, do we upgrade treatment, does the public pay to upgrade treatment, the ratepayers in those towns, or money loaned from the state or from the federal government, or do we protect the source? So in drinking water protection, we utilize or advocate for what we call the multiple barrier approach. And so the treatment plan is one barrier, using disinfection is another barrier, but protection of the source and prevention of pollution is the first barrier to contamination. And so, your ecosystem is your first and most important filter, especially in forest lands. So it's pretty well known and shown that forested watersheds produce the best quality water. In a natural forest, the ecological and hydrologic processes are going to store and filter and deliver water to downstream users in a controlled fashion. They provide other services, and including salmon habitat and lamprey habitat, carbon sequestration. And generally speaking, what works for drinking water quality and for protecting drinking water is going to be what works for salmon habitat and other fish and wildlife habitat. The interests of those are very much aligned. Conversion away from forest is not good. Even a working forest is generally going to provide better water quality than non-forested land uses. And urbanization near streams is problematic, certainly. A healthy system is going to provide better quality drinking water. There's risks inherited with degraded or polluted systems. So, if you get a lot of nutrient pollution or warm, stagnant water, algae blooms can occur, and that's not going to be good for fish. But those harmful algae blooms release toxins that are harmful or even fatal to animals or humans, and challenging to treat. Sediment pollution really gets in the way of filtering water sources, and also makes it harder to remove and kill disease-causing bacteria and viruses during water treatment. So, disturbances are a part of living in a forested landscape. As Gabe alluded to, we've had too little disturbance for a while in terms of not having enough fire. In this part of the state that we're talking about, the more typical fire regime would be weather driven, and some larger events with mixed severity. But there was, prior to European settlement, quite a lot of native forest management practices that included fire, and that did keep fuel loads from accumulating in some places, and kept open spaces in the forest for first foods like huckleberries that would serve as natural fire breaks as well. And to clarify in this context, when I'm talking about natural forests, prior to European settlement, these were not unmanaged forests. Some of the farther away from where people commonly lived were less impacted, but human beings were certainly a part of the system and had a demonstrable effect that was part and enhanced the stability and resiliency of the systems. So disturbance events aren't necessarily bad. Fire clears space and allows succession to occur anew. Disturbance events that seem pretty dramatic, like a forested hill slope giving way, and that's the picture on the left here. You can barely see the landslide, but a forested slope giving way and dumping a bunch of sediment and trees into the stream, those can have short-term impacts that are negative, but long-term benefits. From a drinking water perspective, it's just a problem. You've got more sediment for several years. From a fish perspective, that's the creation of habitat occurring over slightly longer timescales. Anthropogenic disturbances like roads and development and clear cuts, those impacts are quite different from the impacts of a natural wildland fire or a landslide on a forested slope, and they have different effects on the system. This is a kind of a diagram just showing different areas on the landscape, the catchments, the transitional channels that only carry water sometimes, landslides that can flush debris and sediment and stone and trees into the water and so on. And I just want to emphasize the connection, and also emphasize that that wood that comes into a system from landslides and from trees going down in riparian areas, those are really the keystone for sediment filtration from a drinking water perspective, and for the creation of fish habitat. So the functions we're looking for from a riparian zone is it's going to trap and filter sediment and nutrients. It's going to be the primary source of large wood that goes into streams as trees fall over during storms or die and crumble. It's a source of energy and prey for fish species. And so this is a zone that, if it's allowed to go its own way over time, it will generate these values and will generate down wood to function as filters, and it will stay vegetated and therefore trap sediment that could get into the water. And so allowing that to function over one site potential tree height's ideal. A site potential tree, for those who don't know, is the average height that a tree would grow on that site, during the course of its lifespan. And so in a really moist site with good deep soil, that could be 100, a couple 100 feet even, on the Oregon coast. As far as the function, like a larger diameter tree is going to be a better key piece of large woody debris. It's going to do a better job of slowing the water down and trapping gravel and creating safe spaces for fish. Having a diverse ages and species within a riparian zone will contribute to that recruitment of large wooden pool formation over time. It's important to think about these things not just over, the time scales of a human lifetime, because that's not the time scale that a forest and a stream network operates in. These really happen over scales of hundreds of years. There's a pretty good summary of the information for people who want to know more in the environmental impact statement from the Bureau of Land Management's Western Oregon Resource Management Planning work that concluded in 2016. Moving on to the steep slopes, so these are going to be greater than 60 or 70%. Landslides and debris flows do contribute wood and sediments, coarse stuff like gravel and boulder and cobble, and fine stuff like silt and sand to stream systems. In the short term, that's going to be hard on salmon, but it'll create habitat in the long term. From a drinking water perspective, it's just hard, but it matters what the composition of that slide is for both purposes. Soil saturation is the trigger, so high amount of rainfall, but what's there for vegetation and what kind of rock underlies it all is really important. Erodible rock like sandstone, those slopes are gonna slide more often, and then something that has a lot of vegetation, especially multi-layered vegetation with a lot of tree species and ages, that's going to be more resilient and less likely to saturate and fail than something that's recently been cleared by logging or fire. And if there are large trees present in a landslide, then that wood and sediment is going to become habitat in time. But that's also good from a water quality perspective if a slope failure is laden with wood, because the debris flow is and the slide is going to travel a shorter distance. It's going to scour less out. It's going to be smaller in volume, generally speaking. And when that wood hits the system, a lot of that stuff will set up behind it. And that fine sediment that's such a problem for drinking water treatment is going to set up and get blocked by the wood. It's small. And so as you get the velocity drop in the water behind log jams or behind big accumulations of wood, that's really, again, going to function as your first set of filters for downstream drinking water treatment, in addition to the habitat value. So on steep slopes, this picture here is from one of my hikes, where you can see there's kind of a decaying snag and then a young hemlock underneath it, some maples hanging around too that are growing out of the side of that decaying snag. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on here. That's at least 3 ages of trees in one close-in photo. I really like hemlock seedlings, so if I go through and look at my pictures, I'm going to find a lot of pictures of hemlocks, growing on nurse logs and so on. But that uneven aged structure and that diversity of ages and structures is helpful on steep slopes, because it's going to disperse the water coming down in intense rainstorms and thereby reduce the slope failure probability. The roots, especially those from large old conifer trees, is going to help anchor slopes. And then something I didn't put in here, which is that those conifers are transpiring and photosynthesizing year round. And so when the soil's starting to get saturated, they're pumping a lot of water out to form biomass and create sugars and just pumping it back into the sky. And that'll help prevent those soils from getting saturated in the first place. So, again, and hold it up. Nope, it's not going to show it. a good summary of that is in the book here, Landslides, Processes, Prediction, and Land Use by Seidel and Ochi, a North American scientist and a Japanese scientist who've worked together quite a bit. As I said before, disturbances are a normal part of forest life. The upper picture is the B&B complex fire, which was a big one up in the Cascades, and then down there is on the bottom is the Biscuit Fire, which is in southwestern Oregon. Diverse, uneven age forests are generally going to burn with less severity and leave a greater biological legacy. Big, thick bark trees are less likely to die in fire, for example. When you have gaps in the canopy, that's going to reduce or prevent crown fire and increase the survival rate. And then, those trees left after fire, that's not a waste, because that dead wood is the core of what makes a forest live and what builds soil over the long time scales. That legacy is the heart of the forest to come. And if you go through and look at the B&B complex fire now, there's lots of dead snags and so on, and lots of flowers and live trees growing up, the old survivors that made it through the fire there. It's amazingly biologically rich landscape, and it recovered and bounced back really, really quick. And on other fronts, dense monocultures here on the coast, for example, they're going to be more susceptible to insects and disease. So, the pine beetles are going nuts in those dense monocultures right now with warmer weather year round. And then, Swiss needlecast has been an issue on the coast where monocultures of Douglas fir were put into place. There's nothing to break up the spread of a disease that loves wet weather and high tree density, but that can be dealt with by a lot of structural diversity and species diversity. Hemlocks, for example, aren't susceptible. The Sitka spruce aren't susceptible. So from this is just kind of a diagram that I like for showing some of the concept on fire, which is where you have trees packed together and they're all one type and one height. Once that fuel gets up to the canopy, it's just going to go. When you have more diverse stands that have diversity of structure and diversity of species, you create gaps where you have trees that don't burn as well, where you have just grass and meadow, and that'll, if not stop the fire, it'll reduce the intensity and create opportunities for survival and a good mosaic post fire. And then it'll bounce back quick. You'll have living trees. You'll have differences there. Wind throws another one, so on this picture here, this is from Trapper Creek. I know this down tree well. I've run all up and down it. It was ancient when it fell, big enough, even my poor balance, I can run down it. And it's going to be there for centuries. And that made a gap that was then filled by younger trees. And down at the end of it, there's this bright sunny area with a tree growing right in the sunny spot. And so that creates gaps and that, kind of begets more diversity on hard edges, where, there's a big opening has been made, then all those trees along that hard edge are going to be more susceptible. And so rather than a few trees going down, you'll end up with lines of trees going down. So it's a different story. And then those older, unmanaged, or more diverse structured forests store a lot of biomass. And again, this big old tree comes into place that the tons of biomass in that tree, that carbon is going to stay locked up for centuries as it slowly breaks down and creates habitat for more trees that are going to lock up more biomass. So this is I'm going to have to, I think, probably speed up a little bit here, but basically this diagram is showing the difference between a hard edge, which is that bar on the left that's quite a bit larger than where you don't have hard edges, and you just a lot less wind throw. And I would note that those big wind storms seem to be happening more as we get into the reality of climate change. Diverse forest structures, older type structures. Right after that reset, those early successional ecosystems themselves have benefits. Like I mentioned, stream flows are more moderated in a in a diverse, mature type forest type structure. The peaks are smaller, which means less erosion, and the base flows are higher, which means better conditions late in the summer and early in the fall before the rains return to us. And then part of that is better absorption, and part of it's that older trees use water more efficiently. There's a lot going on there, and like Gabe said, this isn't a if you do X you'll get Y kind of thing, which is the reductionist model. This is really more of an integrated idea where you've got a lot of things going on and they're all interrelating and contributing. And if you start tracing those fluxes of energy and matter, you end up with tremendously complicated webs, and you can't take any piece out of the web and understand its place as an independent thing, because they're all interdependent. So, I think probably one of the key points is that natural disturbances like fires and landslides occur more infrequently. There's a long period of recovery and stability in between, and that's what Dr. Gordon Reeves calls a pulse disturbance. It happens, and then there's a long kind of recovery and readaptation time afterwards. Human activities are occurring a lot more frequently, and it's just in a forest time scale, that's an ongoing thing, and that's what he would term a press disturbance. So a timber harvest every 35, 40, 50 years, that from a human perspective, that's like a long time between disturbances, but from the ecosystem's perspective, that's pretty short, because normally you'd have a low intensity disturbance every 100 or 200 years, or a higher intensity disturbance every 300 or 400. And so that's something to consider. I think is that an ecological time frame and a human time frame are not the same. Our lives are kind of a blink compared to the life of a forest. As far as climate change, it's real, it's upon us. We're seeing it now. Higher overall temperatures, summers are drier, flows are getting lower in summer and early autumn, and so the kind of interaction of higher stream temperatures and lower stream flows is going to cause more problems if we don't act to moderate things. And then the wetter winters with more intense storms. We've actually had a slight increase most years in total precipitation, but it's coming more concentrated in big bursts. And so that means more erosion where you have exposed ground or bare ground. As far as where we have diverse forest structure in this northwest part of Oregon, there's not a lot of it. That legacy of logging, legacy of fire is a big part of it, and there's relatively little. For this part of Oregon, there's relatively little public land. There's some state forest land, some BLM land, a little bit of Forest Service land, but it's not really until you get farther south into the Siuslaw National Forest that we have more public land. So, to create and protect and restore, diverse uneven age forests is going to take some changes in the choices of what we do on private lands. I think I'm going to kind of jump forward a little bit here. The main point I want to make here is there's some really good work from the drinking water realm showing that where you have more forest cover, treatment costs are lower. So there's an economic incentive for public water systems to want to have a good, resilient forest cover in their drinking water source area. And that investing money in forest and watershed protection, it's going to have a much greater cost savings. There's very little you can do for drinking water that has as good of a return on investment as investing in protecting forest lands. Generally what we try to do in drinking water protection, which is a voluntary and collaborative program, we're not a regulatory program, as we've done this, identify the contaminant sources and the risks, and then help encourage, beg, plead, whatever, to get folks to use risk reduction and avoidance strategies to prevent contamination. It's kind of a couple of viewpoints you can have on this. One is that, all right, we're gonna see what, if we do this, if we do X, it's almost definitely gonna cause degradation of water quality and the ecosystem. And so we won't do the things that cause certain degradation. And that's one approach. Another approach is to say, okay, what are practices that we think or know or have good evidence that they're low risk or no risk to those water resources, to those ecosystems, and we're going to do that. And that's more of a protective approach. And so in between that, if you go below here, degradation is almost certain. And if you do this, you're almost certainly okay. There's the gray area. And so that gray area is, the uncertainty. And so what we advocate for and ask for is for people to use approaches that where the uncertainty is less as far as what's going to happen to the ecosystem, where we're trying to be certain that we're protecting the ecosystem. And so like a reflection of that is the riparian protection approaches that the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management use on the federal forest lands. Those are more geared towards, if we do this, we're fairly certain as we can be, that we're going to protect the system and maintain water quality. And if you do that, and if you're able to do that, it saves money in the long term. So the plug for the land trust, of course, is to help with getting land that is a drinking water source into management that is going for certainty of protection and certainty of avoiding risk. And by doing that for drinking water, you're also doing that for salmon and other aquatic species. And I think that's all I've got. And, I think it's time for Q&A. So I want to say thanks to Gabe for his piece, and also thanks to Ben and the Lower Nehalem Community Trust folks for the opportunity.
Okay, so I am going to ask Gabe and Ben to join Joshua on the screen. And let's see. Okay. So to my fellow behind the scenes crew, my Q&A box is now working. So, so we're going to move ahead here. So the first question I think is aimed at Gabe because it came up during his talk, and we'd like to know what WTD stands for.
WTD was that? I looked in my PowerPoint and there's no references to WTD.
Maybe Sue will give us a little bit more of a hint.
Large woody debris, maybe LWD.
No, might it be water table depth? Was there?
Sue, if you're still on the call, maybe you could give us a little context for where you saw that acronym. So from Ted Chu, we have what percentage of coastal forests were periodically burned by fires set by Indigenous peoples? And did these fires include mature old growth forest, or were they mostly confined to brush fields? What was the frequency of these fires in coastal drainages?
So a little bit, I'll jump in there.
Okay, thanks.
Ted, that's a good question. Most of my work is more Willamette Valley, Main Stem Columbia, where Mount Hood, Mount Adams, Mount St. Helens, a lot of the major mountains and of the Cascade Range and beyond were burned regularly. Josh mentioned it. It was in reference to promoting mountain huckleberry growth and soil conditions. Also to manage for brush and for unhealthy trees. From everything that I can tell and from what I've learned in the Coast Range, it was similar. So places along the Coast Range, primarily the Coast Range, Mary's Peak, some of the taller points, but also in the prairies, Oak Savanna, the Western Oregon tribes heavily rely on both tarweed, which is a first food and which is a lowland sustainer of fire, and it's heavily propagated through fire, the renewal of soils, oak savanna, oak nuts are also an important food. So what percentage? And if, I would say 75 to 80% is a rough estimate, just based on my knowledge and a lot of my research and working with indigenous groups throughout the state. But could be more. Mountainous areas and lowland prairies were and are very important.
Okay, thank you. So Sue did add a hint here. So WTD was one of the animals listed on the first foods.
Oh, okay. WTD. Let me look at that. Pull that up. Oh, white-tailed deer.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you, Sue. All right. Let's see. So we have a lot of people that want to talk about logging. So there may be more than one of you that wants to talk about this. So the question has to do with clear cut versus selective logging. Commentary is clear cuts and on slopes seem to create lots of debris and sediment downstream. Will Oregon have more responsible type regulations so that logging can be done with more responsibility from companies? And then there's a more local related question around why are they logging every inch of ground around Wheeler, Nehalem, et cetera? Who is doing it? What's their openness to adopting an ecological approach?
I think I'll jump on those, and then if Gabe wants to add something to it, he certainly can. So for Sherry's questions, clear cut versus selective logging. Yeah, so like if we take the example of steep slopes, there's pretty good evidence that there's very good evidence that clear cut logging compared to unlogged forest, you're increasing the frequency of sliding. And then the lack of wood means that if a slope does fail, it's going to travel farther, and there's not going to be much wood in with that slide, to set up habitat downstream. So you're getting the impact without much of the benefit, seems to be what the research indicates. With selective logging on steeper slopes, you're maintaining that tree cover, you're maintaining that root strength, and so your slope failures aren't likely to be as elevated, if they're elevated at all. And if it did go, if the slope did fail, you would have trees in there to perform those ecological functions in stream. There's not a lot of research on selective logging because, west of the Cascade Crest for a long time heavily managed timberlands, it's been mostly clear cut logging or, no logging. So that middle path of selective logging, there's not as much information and data there. I can't answer the question about whether Oregon's going to change its regulations. Like I said early on, that's been put by the legislature firmly in the hands of the State Department of Forestry, and more particularly the Board of Forestry that sets the rules for the Department of Forestry. So if there would be changes, that would either come from the Board of Forestry and the Department of Forestry, or it would come from the legislature. I think I've run into that a lot, where people hope that DEQ or think the DEQ should come in and make changes, but checks and balances. So my agency can only do what the legislature empowers us to do. And then as far as Suzanne's question, that's the land she's talking about is most likely that private industrial land. So it's going to be I couldn't say specifically without digging into the county tax records who owns what. But the most logging that's done on private industrial lands, it's investor owned companies, and so there's a few that are more willing to do an ecological approach. Mostly, they're going to be doing a more economic return centered approach rather than an ecologically centered approach. So one of the things we've tried to do in drinking water source areas is, well, what about, ecosystem services payments, for example, to take an ecological approach and sort of combine the needs of drinking water systems with the desire to make the maximum return. Another option is, what if water systems own their own forest land so they can make the choices? But the simple answer to the question is that it's the landowners, which are mostly investor-owned companies that own the land.
Okay. So let's see, we have a few questions relative to buffers. So I'm going to read the one that's in the Q&A box first, and then add some that have come in through an email. So is DEQ involved in the negotiations with timber companies on increasing the voluntary buffer and setbacks along waterways? And along with that is, how would you assess the impacts of the 50-foot slope distance buffers for a fish-bearing stream that are required by Oregon's Forest Practices Act? What buffer width would you recommend? And I think I'll stop there and let you answer those questions.
All right, I'll take them in order.
Okay.
The answer to the first one is that I think she's talking about the negotiations between the coalition of environmental groups and the timber companies about adopting a habitat conservation plan on private lands. So I've been involved in a habitat conservation plan effort on state forests as a representative of DEQ. The role for DEQ and other state agencies in the negotiations between environmental groups and timber companies so far has been as observers, and that's being facilitated directly by the governor's office. And those two parties are trying to come to an agreement on submitting a habitat conservation plan to the federal government. And so we don't have a direct role in that. At this point, we are just observers. If it was adopted, it would have the force of federal law as the habitat conservation plan. The question on 50-foot buffers on fish-bearing streams and whether or not they're adequate. So that has been studied. From a drinking water perspective, 50 to 100 feet is generally, you're going to get the riparian filtration of sediment moving over the surface. 100 to 200 feet, you're going to get the large wood recruitment that for in-stream over the long term. The most direct water quality parameter that is not drinking water related is temperature. And temperature is extremely important for fish and other aquatic species. And so 50 feet is in most cases not going to be adequate to prevent heating of the stream. That was studied pretty extensively by a lot of people, most recently by the study referred to as Ripstream that the Oregon Department of Forestry did. And so, 50 feet, that's not going to keep enough shade to prevent temperature impacts to the stream, and accumulating over the landscape that can raise temperature to where it's problematic for salmon, native amphibians, and so on.
Okay, I'm going to jump to a question here that I think is Gabe's to answer, and give Josh a little bit of a break here. It occurs to me that the certain practices we speak of for the protection of drinking water sources for humans must be applied to all watersheds equally. How do we shift from being so people-centric to more holistic by recognizing all water is drinking water for many non-human species? Certainly, the Indigenous perspective more closely embraces this reality, but what is a strategy for moving the larger society to embrace it as well?
Thanks, Doug. I would say that's kind of embracing the relational worldview of a more balanced ecosystem. I mean, it sounds simple in that phrase, but I think logging is a great example of what in Oregon was once community and township supported. And then, similarly to landowning and real estate practices, outside capitalistic practices came in and lobbied and supported loopholes that cut out the small towns from their tax basis. It's kind of similarly, like, where's the balance? Like, when do we have enough? And kind of listening to Josh, a lot of my life has been spent in Eastern Oregon, where there's, as Josh referenced, a much different relationship with water. Most of the drinking water is pumped from groundwater sources. Ranchers and irrigators over the last 100 years or so use a lot of the free flowing or the surface water to irrigate and to raise crops. And which has had a historic negative effect on fish and wildlife. So I think really in what's happened there and what's been happening, I think is compromise and balance. I think kind of setting some realistic parameters, looking at a long-term future through Indigenous worldviews. We're not looking at 1 or 2 fiscal years. We're thinking generations out, 50, 100 years, similar to the forest timelines. What's the larger perspective? When in regards to the idea of fire, that's one ecological reminder that has kind of forced us to think about it, whether we like it or not. So sometimes that's the greatest motivator, fear and your own personal safety, and kind of reflecting on, the earth balancing itself. Obviously, with the lack of drinking water for non-human species, I think we're already seeing the results of that through climate change, through studies of alpine mountainous regions. Locally in cities like Portland, they've already seen water tables changing due to development and kind of increased mismanagement of stormwater and such. Draining, taking water from your gutters, putting it straight in the large watershed, and kind of cutting out that natural forest filtration system that Josh referenced. So we'll start seeing more signs of kind of ignoring, I think, these very large issues. Obviously, things going down to insects, bees. I think we're seeing a lot of interest in pollination and pollinators, and in respect to 75 to 80% of our foods coming from those sources or of relating to pollination. So in short, I think these things will kind of come around and we'll be forced to deal with them at some point, whether we act now or not.
Thank you, Gabe.
Not to be ominous, but
okay. So why not charge the timber industry for the costs they cause others to shoulder?
That's a good question. That's a good question. It's also a question that I will just freely say is above my pay grade. And then but it does touch on that burden of proof and that, the uncertainty piece that I talked about towards the end, which is, where we don't know for sure. And showing that if I log site here, we're definitely going to see an impact here. That's almost an impossibility. And, in terms of proving definite damage, you can show how things work on probabilities, and that's what the research does, and it does show that you can have a relationship between intensive logging and changes to water quality that are a problem for drinking water systems. But in terms of a standard of you can definitely show that this action caused this problem way downstream, that's hard to do. And so that becomes a policy question about where do we want to put the burden of proof, and that's really one for for not for a staff scientist at an agency to answer, but that's one for policy makers like legislators that they have to answer, which is, when we can't say for sure who bears the cost of the uncertainty, should it be, communities or fish, or should the cost of the uncertainty be borne, by those making money? Like that's a question to answer through the mechanisms of a democratic republic, I think, rather than one that I can answer as a staff scientist.
Well, thanks for trying.
I'll jump in there a little bit, Debbie, too, and maybe not to answer, just more to just comment
Mhm.
to it. I think, by and large, the corporate interests that have taken over the timber industry and many companies, I think, have kind of adopted or maintained that kind of almost that manifest destiny approach, or that that tragedy of the commons, or that there's an unlimited resource, and that things are that as long as we don't have to bear witness to the results, and there's a profit and limited local jobs, these things can sustain. And we're in as long as money equals power, and in our hierarchical world, these things will continue, I believe. I think that's what's brought us here. And surely I would love to also ask that same question, and what I would then also pose, what do these corporations see for what's the long term? What happens in 50 or 100 years at this continued rate? I think we can look back now, kind of in hindsight, and kind of see how that industry has shifted and changed. And our old growth trees are now in Oregon are mostly gone, with some of the fire season last year. So kind of, I would, kind of agree, or maybe not agree, but also pose that question, and then a few more, like, what is the long-term perspective here? Like, what is the long-term plan? So
Thank you. Okay, so we're nearing the end of our time, but I have a couple of questions relative to Josh's presentation that I want to make sure we get addressed, and then we'll come back and ask one more final question for anyone in the group to answer. So the first one is, Joshua, can you put your last slide up again? Because there wasn't enough time to read it. So would you mind doing that? Okay. So is that your last one? You're on mute, Josh.
Yeah, that I think this, other than the slide that says, are there any questions? This
Oh,
is
okay.
the last one.
Okay. All right.
Same picture. Yeah.
Okay.
I think I had this one up for a bit, so they're probably referring to this slide.
Okay. Great. Thank you for bringing that up. And then the other similar question, can Joshua publish his reference list?
Yeah, the answer is yes. I can make the list of references I had in the presentation available.
Okay, so the presentation will be on our YouTube channel later. So
yeah, that might be hard for folks to run down, since it's just the citation. It doesn't have the title, journal,
Okay.
etc. So I can talk with you or with Ben about how to make the full citations available.
Okay.
I would add for the group, that's just really a kind of a sample of stuff, examples for the concepts given. It's by no means comprehensive as far as references on the subjects I touched upon.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Okay. So I am going to ask one more question of the group, and then Ben, I'll let you pick it up from there. So this question is, could DEQ develop a simple calculation? Actually, I guess this is more for Josh. Develop a simple calculation for the public of the social costs, specifically jobs and water, of continued non-sustainable forestry practices?
I think the answer to that is no, and it's because there is no simple calculation. To reference again a concept that's very helpful that Gabe put up, that is really central, even from a Western scientific perspective, to understanding ecology. It's, there's no simple if X then Y. We do have some averages in terms of forest cover in a relationship to drinking water treatment, which was in a couple of the references I had. But there's no simple way to calculate that if you do this, with forest practices, you'll get this result on water treatment. So, it's really, also for me personally, it's beyond my expertise to be able to do that. I think we can say that there is a lot of room from what's typical now to make changes that reduce risk. Such as wider riparian areas, more risk. More risk is averted. Doing that, leaving trees on steep slopes reduces risk. One thing that's been done pretty well on forest lands in Oregon is better road management. Roads have come a long ways versus where they were in the 50s and 60s, and we've seen the results in terms of reducing risk to drinking water and aquatic systems. And so, we can pick out those places on the landscape where some changes will have the biggest difference for reducing risk to aquatic systems and drinking water, but turning that into a solid dollars and cents sort of thing is beyond my ability.
Okay. Thanks for trying. Okay. Just one more, Ben, and then I'll give it to you. I want to get another one of these questions that came in through an email. So, does Oregon monitor water quality and the accumulation of pollutants in crabs and shellfish along its many rivers and bays?
I guess that's me again. So we have an extensive water quality monitoring program in the state, and some of that includes tissue monitoring, like in the Willamette River system, for example, of fish and crayfish. But specifically for coastal shellfish, the monitoring there is really designed, that the state does, is really geared towards are the immediate and harmful algae monitoring. It's not really, geared towards long-lived toxic contaminants. That's a little more hit and miss on, and DEQ doesn't have a program for that. I cannot speak to, though, on the food side, right? Like food safety, that's regulated by the Oregon Department of Agriculture and the Oregon Health Authority. So I'm not familiar enough with Oregon Department of Agriculture's shellfish sampling, for example, to be able to tell you whether or not they're catching things like pesticides or other contaminants that aren't just kind of the basic. Do we see fecal bacteria? Do we see algae that are poisonous type of questions?
I can speak to that just a little bit, and not especially to shellfish or in our coastal bay systems, but in my work in fisheries, specifically relating to lamprey, who are anadromous, who are born in freshwater systems, spend most of their life there, travel to the ocean, and then return. And unlike salmon, they don't return to their stream of birth, but to suitable stream habitats. They're driven by their olfactory sense, pheromones. But in the few studies that I've participated in and followed, despite having that migratory life cycle, their tissues really spoke to their stream of birth and the correlating land use. Several fish were birthed or spawned in the Yakima River in Washington, which is a heavily AG pesticide-rich stream, and several others correlated with. So kind of the atypical pesticides or the predominant pesticides used in the natal streams were connected to the fish at its adult stage, which was on average about 10 years, 10 years later. And, fish, lamprey, their tissues sustain, pesticides, chemicals in different ways than shellfish. So that could vary, but in the fisheries world, some of those studies are tied and being related now, and there is showing proof that some of these kind of lifetime chemicals follow and stay with you throughout your whole life. Similar to humans and things, Teflon and other things that are in all of us and will be in us when we die.
All right. I'm going to thank you both for wonderful discussion. We have about 4 minutes left, and I'm going to kind of ask you each to take a very short amount of time and give a very short answer to a very long concept question. And that is, most of the focus in these discussions are on trees. What's their age, their height diversity, their timber value, how much shade they provide over the stream, whether there's big wood in the channels or carbon sequestration, et cetera. So the question is, what about the non-tree forest structure, soil, ground cover, mosses, lichen, invertebrates, fungi, et cetera, and how these evolve over many decades? Could you each just, from your own perspective, very shortly, like in a half a minute or a minute, just give some ideas about those concepts, the values of those to a forest?
I'll go ahead and jump in there. I would say, kind of in short, Ben, I mean, all of those things are important to a healthy, temperate rainforest here in the Willamette Valley, where I reside. Those are all, there's many, in the various forest layers, there's the natural filtration. But as Josh mentioned in his presentation, a healthy forest has a diverse tree stand and diverse ages. Our forest floor is really indicative of our soils. Our forest ecosystem, I think, in itself is really something that's works within balance. From our ground covers to our soil, which really dictates everything, to our shrubs, which provide many of our foods, our berries in Western Oregon, and our small trees, which provide that extra layer of forest filtration, protection, and then our large trees, obviously one of the most focused on pieces, which provide many things, filtration, fire protection, shade, in the case, food, shelter for many living things. So a diverse forest, a healthy forest, has all of those layers and in a very healthy and intact set. So I think it's a good question. I think it's all certainly important, and I'll leave a couple of minutes for Josh here.
Yeah, that's very important and very interrelated. I'll give a couple examples. One is the large salmon runs of the past were a great source of nutrients. Those fish swimming out from the ocean were bringing with them to enhance the growth of trees and other plants, and then those trees and other plants enhance the growth and survival of this young salmon that would then return to the ocean. And so that cycle of relationship there, like the trees caring for the salmon and the salmon returning and caring for the trees, is very, from a scientific perspective, very relevant, very real. You know, and then another example is that in starting around 80 to 100 years of age, you start getting large accumulations and canopies in these forests of different kinds of lichens, including the lungwort lichens, and those fix nitrogen, and they fix nitrogen in amounts that promote tree growth over the long term. And so the trees provide the scaffolding for those, and those provide the nitrogen for the trees. You know, the trees themselves are dependent on and in a close relationship with a whole host of fungi, where the trees feed the fungi, and the fungi provide protection from disease. They provide nutrients. They provide communication between neighboring trees and nutrient sharing between neighboring trees. And those are just a few examples. I mean, we can get into like how, you know, the consumption of dead matter in the forest floor by a host of creatures, which then themselves are consumed, and so on, and an endless cycle creates soil, which is not just, you know, mineral dust, but a living matrix of innumerable living things. And so, you know, trees are the easiest thing for me to measure and for us to measure, and they're the direct value that's derived economically from forests for the most part. But you know, they're really the most visible link in a never-ending chain.
All right. Thank you both, Gabe and Josh, for your generous participation in this evening's webinar. And I thank all of our attendees as well. We appreciate your stopping in for our webinar, and we hope you will visit our website and stay involved in the Trust's activities. We recorded this evening's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to the video recording on our YouTube channel. Also, if you have any further questions, please feel free to include them in reply to the email, and we'll get an answer to you as soon as possible. Thanks again for your attendance, and please enjoy the rest of your evening.
Okay, we're clear.
Okay. Some of those didn't want to be removed very easily. Can't figure that out. So,
You're kicking people off. Is that what you're doing?
yeah. Yeah. So, Mike, do you want to turn the YouTube off at this point? Oh. So, Mike, are you with us?
Yes.
Are you turning?
Trying to get my picture on.
Oh, is the
There we go.
is YouTube still on?
No, it's gone. It's
Oh.
off. It's saved.
Okay, good. Thank you. All right. So, yeah, I don't know exactly what was going on with the Q&A. we got almost all the questions in the Q&A box answered, but John was questioning whether or not the attendees actually knew that they were being answered because of the way that I was responding. And basically, once I selected that we were going to answer the question live, I couldn't do anything else with that question. So, so hopefully they were listening.
And I think, Mike, the YouTube is still running.